Thank you very much for your patience, everybody. I will start with some introductions, and thank you very much for your interest in this webinar. We have, as I said, more than 1,000 people registered. While people are still joining, I would like to give a couple of words about the purpose of the webinar and how the flow is going to happen. So the webinar will take place in 3 parts. First, I'm going to present a couple of main findings of the market update that we published in 20th of May, so a couple of weeks ago. And then I'm going to moderate some discussion with our 6 analysts who will join the webinar with their cameras after I finish my presentation. Then we will open the floor for your questions. And then I will be moderating the questions. I'm going to ask the questions in threes so that we have a easier logistical way of answering them. And you can basically use the questions section in GoToWebinar if you want to ask any question to us. And if we are not able to answer all of your questions, we will be basically try to get back to you via email. And basically answer your question or try to answer your question. So I'd like to give a little bit of a background for those who basically follow IEA's market reports. We usually publish this report in October, as you probably know, and it's usually a 5-year forecast. This year, after the COVID-19 happened, we decided to change the approach, and we basically started to see where we can actually do the analysis in order to assess the impact of COVID-19. And we created this new online publication, which is free and available on IEA's website. And it's basically an outlook for just 2020 and 2021. This doesn't go beyond 2021. I'm going to explain why in my presentation. The publication that we have it online now looks at 3 sectors, electricity, transport, biofuels, and qualitatively on heat. So we will try to cover all of them in this question. We are going to send for those who participated into the webinar the slides of this presentation after. And you can ask questions to us afterwards through the IEA webinar email account. And on this note, I would like to start the presentation. And we basically saw the world pre-COVID in various ways when we published our recent market forecast in October 2019. And we looked at, again, as usual, renewable electricity capacity additions, biofuels production, and renewable heat consumption. And when we look at the pre-COVID world, we were expecting a record year for 2020 in terms of capacity additions of electricity. We were expecting another record year for biofuels production and also a growth in renewable heat consumption. So we were expecting for all these technologies actually a growth between 5 to 10% in this year, basically, when we were in October. However, when the COVID came, we had to reassess our forecasts, and this is what we are going to present. And in terms of what happened for renewable energy markets, business is not usual. You can see in the figure that in multiple countries that we show that number of days where countries implemented COVID-19 countermeasures. So these can be social distancing rules, partial or full lockdowns. You can see the top renewable energy growth markets and states in some countries had 2 to 3 months of measures implemented. Does this mean that the oil construction was halted? No, not necessarily. The lockdown measures have different various ways of interpreting the energy sector's role. In some countries, there were full stop of construction activity, or manufacturing activity. In some others, we saw actually a continuous construction. But all of these rules have something in common that we realized is that everything is slower than usual, both for the supply chain, but also related to construction activity. That's why we have to reassess our forecast. And when you look at the renewable net capacity addition since 2007, renewable capacity additions actually almost tripled in the coming decade or so. This was a tremendous achievement. And when we were entering into 2019, we saw actually renewable capacity additions increase again, breaking another record. And this record was driven by both cost reductions and policies. And we actually, when we published in October this report, we were expecting this boom of renewables in 2019. We actually published a semi-report in September to highlight this. However, the actual what happened was slightly lower than our expectations, so we overestimated actually in 2019 renewable energy markets. But when we enter into 2020, renewable capacity additions are expected to go down by 13%. So instead of a record year, we expect actually the slight decline. Why the slight decline? There are multiple reasons behind this. We had basically delays related to construction. We had several countries implementing policies that enable the delay of the projects that's supposed to come online in 2020. But also we are seeing different segments of the markets in electricity where actually some projects are abandoned or cancelled or postponed beyond the level, beyond the forecast period that we have. What we saw in 2020, in February, we started to see some supply chain issues in China, and then this spread out to Europe, United States, and India. For solar PV and wind, these manifest themselves differently. But overall, there is a disruption in the normal flow of the market. However, we expect actually most of these delayed projects to come online in 2021. Our forecast shows a rebound. This means that actually renewables have been resilient to the crisis. The growth will resume in 2021. And this is basically due to there are a lot of projects were in the pipeline, they're already financed, and we expect most of these finance projects to be commissioned. And then we expect actually additional projects in the pipeline that we saw in the end of 2019 still see some of the financing activity to be commissioned in 2021. When we look at the different technologies and how they are impacted by COVID, there are actually different ways of looking at it. The first point is that projects, they have long lead times versus projects that have short lead times are affected a little bit differently. Let me start with hydropower. The projects which are the largest projects in the world that are in China right now, they have the 7 to 10 year lead times usually, so those projects can actually shelter some of the delays that they can have. So they are mostly limited effect of COVID-19 we will see in these projects. Another technology is basically offshore wind, who see a limited impact because most of the projects are already in the pipeline. They've been financed and advanced stage of the construction before the COVID-19 crisis hit the world. So we expect actually not a significant impact on offshore wind. The most affected one is actually rooftop PV, and the reason is quite simple. These projects are basically very short cycle projects, and the investors are small companies or individuals, and in this current economic crisis that the world is experiencing right now, we are seeing basically an important reprioritization of the investments in these small applications all around the world. If you look at the first 3 months of deployment, there's a significant slowdown. We also saw an incredible layoffs in the sector in key markets due to the slowdown in investment in rooftop PV. And for onshore wind and utility scale PV, of course, these are mostly delays. Thus, we expect an important rebound in 2021 for both onshore wind and utility scale PV. However, for rooftop PV, we expect a slower rebound. And the important thing is to also highlight here the hydropower, which is giving an important hand to the 2021 rebound of overall renewable capacity additions. This big increase in hydropower capacity additions compared to 2020 in 2021 is basically due to 2 mega projects in China that we expect to be commissioned or partially commissioned in 2021. We compare our forecast every year with the previous year. So in this overall rebound history, there is one important development. We actually overall revised down our forecast by 10% or almost 40 gigawatts when you combine the growth of this year and next year. Why did we do that? Because first, the distributed PV, we expect a slower recovery. The second one, there has been a lot of policy changes in various countries, which also affect the revisions that we have. We will discuss them probably separately in the Q&A session. I would like to highlight a few key regions here. So China is in the midst of a policy transition from feed-in tariff or auctions to non-subsidy world. Actually, the crisis hit at this very sensitive moment of the transition, and we actually expecting a much higher PV growth in the coming 2 years. However, we had to revise down this growth in China. Similar policy transitions and uncertainties in Europe resulted us to basically revise down our forecast. We will come back to that later. In India, existing challenges also is getting worse in terms of the financial health of discoms. There's one key bright spot, I would say, in this forecast is United States. And the reason of the United States actually revision of the forecast is due to the last quarter developments after we published our recent forecast in October, and we saw an incredible amount of PV and wind projects being financed as the tax incentives are phasing out. Obviously, in regions in emerging and developing economies where already financing was a difficult challenge for renewable projects to be developed. So we expect actually those challenges to worsen under COVID upcoming financing situations. When we look at beyond 2021, I think it's important to highlight a pipeline and what is the uncertainty beyond 2021. Why, and this is also a partial answer why we don't do the forecast up to 2025 this year. The reason is simple, because we expect in the pipeline that we are keeping for wind and PV projects, which represent the largest growth, only 30% of the projects being contracted. Not fully financed, but at least have gone some through an auction or has closed the financing. So we expect only 30% to be. The other 70% is the assumptions of the forecast based on the policy announcements or auction schedules or various other feed-in tariff green certificates that governments promised before COVID-19 that they will allocate in the coming years. And these actually represent 50% of the pipeline that we have that goes to 2025. And we have also an important uncertainty on the private sector-led investments, which almost accounts for a quarter. These investments are corporate PPAs or merchant projects or projects that are combining various measures, but mostly led by the private sector. We have an important uncertainty here. First one is demand, how the demand recovery will happen. It's an important uncertainty whether they will actually initiate more buying of the renewable power in the coming years, especially in the coming 5 years. The second one is the decline in prices affect actually in electricity markets affect the revenues of projects that are more exposed to short-term contracts and wholesale power prices. Another big uncertainty is low gas prices. It affects both private sector-led investments, but also the government plans, which may actually delay some of the investment decisions because of the using of the low and very cheap natural gas instead of contracting new power. I would like to remind that in most of the countries in the world right now, we see, not Africa obviously, where the access issues are, but most of the OECD countries and some emerging economies, we see an important oversupply of capacity in the market, which will actually press further the electricity prices in the coming years. So that's why we see an important challenge in both government side and private sector investment side. On top of this, the economic crisis that we are expected to see in the coming months and maybe year will actually increase the challenges concerning the financing of these projects. One important point is also biofuels. They are actually affected rather significantly under COVID-19 because they are part of the demand side, because these biofuels projects are usually mixed with gasoline or diesel products, where we saw an incredible decline in the first quarter and later in the demand for transport. Obviously this affects directly biofuels production, as less gasoline and diesel are produced, are consumed by the consumers. We will see less ethanol and biodiesel consumed because of the mandated policy. So we expect a 13% decline in biofuels production in 2020. This is simply related to 9% decline in gasoline demand and 6% decline in diesel demand that we expect in 2020. So it is directly connected. Obviously, this is a low revision down of our forecast. Gasoline is affected more than the diesel, so ethanol in that sense is affected more than biodiesel. The reason being, during the crisis, the transportation of goods continued, so it's basically continued to consumption of these fuels. But on the other hand, transport which is related to individuals and cars are more affected, which are mostly using gasoline. We expect a rebound in 2021, going back to the 2019 levels, assuming that the transport sector will recover its activity. And obviously, biofuels are less affected in terms of aviation because their use is very limited. Mostly these are the cars, buses, and other transport sector. So obviously, we saw an interesting trend as well. This rebound is also partially dependent on several policies. So as you can see, we revised down still our forecast in 2021 because we expect some of the policy delays or not delays in implementation of the certain policies. So I would like to conclude this first part of the presentation by saying a few words. Then I'm going to invite my colleagues afterwards. We will do the moderated discussion, then we'll open up for the questions. So overall, renewable electricity, as we saw, is affected by the COVID-19 crisis, but also the previous policy uncertainties that we had. But we expect, despite these, a rebound in 2021 of the capacity additions. But overall, we revised down our forecast. COVID-19 exacerbates existing challenges that renewables had. This doesn't mean that they will be continuously worsened. Government policies are quite important, but for rooftop solar PV, transport biofuels, and renewable heat, these challenges were already pretty high, and this COVID-19 basically makes those challenges even more difficult for companies to invest. With the cost reductions that we saw, obviously it's a big driver for renewables, but renewables are not sheltered from the crisis, mainly for two reasons. One is the uncertainty in terms of the demand, electricity demand or biofuels or heat demand, but also the availability of financing during the economic crisis. And another important point is the role of the governments. So as we mentioned, they need to keep the targets or improve investor confidence if you want to see a larger rebound in the market and accelerate beyond 2021. And I would like to conclude by saying that stimulus packages are actually quite important in the coming months. We saw few signs in several countries, and it's coming up slowly. And we will see basically in the coming months, and we will integrate these stimulus packages into our update forecast, which we aim to publish in Q4 2020. On this note, I'm going to turn off my camera and will ask my colleagues to join the video with their cameras so that we can moderate the discussion. Hi, Farah, welcome.
Hello.
Hi, Yasmina. And I will wait for a couple of seconds for others to join, and I'm going to stop sharing my, I'm going to put this down. So, okay, so everybody's here, perfect, thank you everybody. So actually, I'd like to start with where I left off on biofuels with Farah. So we basically expect, as I mentioned quickly, a decline in the production in 2020. However, can you please give us a little bit of a flavor between countries and regions? Are they all impacted the same way? And there is also a big discussion on how the current low oil prices will affect the renewables. Is it bad? Is it good? If you can give us a little bit of a perspective on that one, I think it will help our audience to understand the dynamics a bit better.
Sure, no problem. So first of all, with transport biofuels, the situation is highly dependent both on the location, so the country in question, but also the type of biofuel. So we have a slide here that I'll talk you through. So let's start with what we have here. So we have the US, Brazil, and Europe. So these are three absolutely crucial markets. So this is a very large share of global production here. And let's have a look at the US first of all. So we can see here that in terms of the implications for 2020, ethanol is notably affected. So between the end of February and April, we had a huge decrease in gasoline demand and also a crash in oil prices as the impacts of the crisis started to take hold. So that caused a near 50% reduction in ethanol output. Now, over that same period of time, ethanol prices reduced by around 35%. So that caused negative operating margins, and therefore plants started to idle. Now, we do already see some early signs of the recovery, so some plants are coming back online. So overall, throughout the year, we would anticipate around a 20% reduction in ethanol output versus 2019 levels. Moving to the middle, to Brazil. First of all, let's have a look at 2019 column. See, this is a really positive year for ethanol in Brazil. So you had record consumption, record production, and on the horizon for 2020 was the new Renewable bio policy. In 2020, we can see things haven't quite turned out that way. So now the industry is under really dual pressure here in Brazil. It's quite unique. So first of all, you have the reduction in transport mobility, therefore gasoline demand, which affects ethanol because there's a 27% mandate. But also in Brazil, ethanol competes directly at the pump with gasoline, and therefore the lower oil prices have lowered gasoline prices, affecting the competitiveness of ethanol. And this couldn't happen at a worse time because this is the start of the season now, and the mills definitely need cash flow to undertake their activities. Conversely, you can see biodiesel actually increases only slightly, but that just shows because first of all, diesel is affected less than gasoline, as you said, and secondly, they increased their mandate to 12%, so there is a bit of a boost there. Looking at Europe and focusing more on the biodiesel side this time, which is the major biofuel used in Europe, we expect a 13% reduction in production in 2020 versus 2019. And that's reflecting the significant reduction in mobility and diesel demand on the continent. So you have challenges such as if a plant is starting to reach its storage capacity, it can no longer continue to produce. And of course, you have the reduction, as I mentioned, of biodiesel prices in reflection of the oil price reduction, which means that the feedstock prices are high, and therefore you get negative operating margins and plants start to come offline. However, this has been cushioned slightly because 2020 is the key year for compliance with the EU Renewable Energy Directive's 10% renewable energy in transport target. So several countries, notable biofuel producers, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, have actually stronger policies this year, which has cushioned this reduction slightly. And one thing I would add here is actually this has longer term implications, because the way the policies is set out in Europe is there is a cap on conventional biofuels, which will be set at the 2020 level plus up to 1% more. So therefore, any disruption of what would have been a normal share of conventional biofuels this year could have implications moving forward. Leaving the contents of the slide and talking about oil prices, a few key points to make here are, firstly, it's worth saying that the fact that most biofuels are supported by policies and by mandates meant that in the past they've been shielded from low oil prices. So oil prices, of course, are cyclical, and during periods of low oil prices in the last 20 years, biofuels production has increased. Of course, this time it's different because we have the demand reduction and the oil price reduction. So there are impacts. So the first main impact would be as oil prices go down, that of course lowers gasoline and diesel prices, which drags down biofuels prices. So as soon as the cost of feedstocks, the cost of energy, and the operational costs of a plant go beyond what they make in terms of the fuel revenue, they can start to drop offline until they see a better outlook. Secondly, we would say there's longer term impacts in terms of if you have a long period of low oil prices with plants having low profitability, then that affects their ability to invest in new production capacity. So that could be particularly detrimental in countries such as India and countries such as Brazil, which have targets, for example, for ethanol till 2030, but you already have a large proportion of the industry, in poor financial health. So the longer oil prices go on, the less they will be able to invest in growing production. And finally, you have the impact of potential policymakers to abandon or delay new policy initiatives as oil prices continue to be low and the cost of subsidizing biofuels increases. And there's already been some cases of that in, for example, in the ASEAN region, where plans to increase the offering of higher biofuel blends onto the market have actually been paused at the current time, probably until the market context changes. So hopefully that clears up those two questions.
Thank you very much, Farah, for this great summary. Actually, it gives a more flavor of the different regions and challenges. And your points are on low oil prices is actually a good transition for the next question that I would like to direct it to Francois, our heat analyst. So we all talk about electricity and transport. Actually, heat accounts for 50% of total final energy consumption that we have. This is heating homes or industrial use of heat to produce anything that we manufacture. And another sector that is expected to be hit by low oil prices is heat sector. And obviously, renewable heat sector has been suffering for a very long time with the lack of policies. And at that point, the COVID-19 come on top. Could you please explain us, Francois, a little bit how the COVID-19 is impacting the industrial and residential heat sectors, what we should expect, and how our audience should, which direction how our audience should look at a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, first we have to distinguish between short and long-term impacts. I think that in direct short-term impacts, the impact was mostly felt in the industry with decreasing economic activity and therefore heat demand in the most heat-intensive subsectors. And in terms of building sector, the impact was a little bit more limited. We could observe a shift from commercial to residential consumption during the lockdown, and as well as delayed installation. But however, these are temporary impacts, and they do not necessarily imply renewable energy being replaced by fossil fuel. Because what matters from a sustainability perspective is not increasing renewable heat consumption per se, but how renewable heats can replace non-renewable heat consumption. And in this perspective, there are some reasons to be concerned by medium and long-term impacts. So as you say, low fossil fuel price can be a problem because it affects the renewable energy cost competitiveness. And this is especially important in a sector with limited policy support. And on top of that, the COVID-19 crisis may have left households and small companies with very uncertain financial situations. And this, in turn, may result in many investments in renewable energy heat being being postponed or cancelled unless there is adequate policy and policy support. The thing is that most of companies working in the renewable heat sector are also small companies, so they are particularly vulnerable to this uncertain financial situations. There is also another point which requires our attention, is that without government intervention, there is a risk that this wide macroeconomic instability resulting from the COVID-19 crisis could have a lasting impact on the construction sector, and this could lead to a slowdown of the rate of retrofits and of the rate of renewal of the building stock, and this could in turn lead to a slower deployment of renewable heat in this sector. So all these elements really make even more important the need for policy support for renewable heat. And there are multiple benefits in terms of job creation, in terms of environmental sustainability, in terms of energy security, resilience, and governments should really view such policies as a key ingredient of their economic stimulus packages, which are being discussed right now. So I hope this answers your question, Amy.
Thank you very much, Francois. This is very, very good. And we are switching back to electricity. We would like to give you a little bit of more insight from the regions. And I would like to turn to Yasmina now. Obviously, in 2019, Europe had a very good year for renewable capacity additions. The market grew an almost unprecedented 25%. However, we expect now in 2020 a sharp drop of these capacity additions by 1/3. And is this decline, Yasmina, really due to COVID-19 or fully due to COVID-19, or we can see other reasons that contribute to this drop?
Good question. Yes, COVID-19 certainly plays a role in this decline, but it's obviously not, it's certainly not the only reason. First and foremost, we actually underestimated 2019 growth. So projects that we thought were going to come online in 2020 actually came online in 2019. So at least less projects available for 2020. So you can see a decline due to that. But there's also other reasons that are contributing to the decline other than COVID-19, and those are policy related issues. It's true that we're seeing a substantial decline, about 12 gigawatts between 2019 and 2020 this year. And about 2/3 of the decline is due to just 3 markets, Spain, Germany, and the United Kingdom, in part due to policy uncertainty and policy transitions in these 3 markets, that if you look at the graph, we were already starting to see the signs of those even last year. So the dotted lines that you're seeing, the dashed dotted lines that you're seeing in black, that's our forecast of the growth between 2019 and 2020 last year. And already last year, in October 2019, when we did the forecast, you started to see either slowing growth, stable growth, but the signs that you can see here from the impacts of policy uncertainty and policy transitions in these markets already prior to COVID. So in Spain, for example, we were last year expecting a 7% decline. This was due to a lull in the project pipeline from uncertainty over the auctions. The auctions are responsible for the 2019 growth rate there, and the government was planning, or is planning, on continuing auctions, but there hasn't been a date yet announced. So we saw a 7% decline. We did that forecast last year. Now, when we did the update last month, the plans are still in place, but still yet no timeline has been given for those auctions. So that, in addition to COVID-related delays for things under construction, we revised down our forecast now to about 50% less in 2020. Similar story in Germany. We saw about a 2% decline in growth, more or less stable when we did the forecast last year, but that actually masks two contradictory trends. We were expecting utility to grow last year, and we're expecting distributed PV to actually decline by about 20%. And the reason for that 20% decline that we were expecting for distributed PV last year was because there was uncertainty over whether feed-in premiums for commercial PV, which is one of the primary support mechanisms there, whether or not that support would actually be extended beyond 52 gigawatt cap, which we expected to happen this year. Again, like Spain, government was announcing an extension, but that was tied or contingent upon consensus in the onshore wind regulations. And so we thought that that would create some slowdown or a pause in what was a very booming growth in distributed PV in Germany. Now, when we did the forecast last month, or we did this update, still at the time of doing the update, there was no legislation in place that actually extended that support. And so therefore that, in addition to COVID-related delays for construction of utility scale, as well as COVID-related impacts on consumer purchasing power or the attractiveness in distributed PV, revise the forecast down. Now, since we've done that update in May, it is true that there has been a consensus that's been reached on the onshore wind regulations in Germany. So we expect support, or we expect that extension of the support to go ahead and proceed. However, it remains to be seen actually how much that prolonged uncertainty in policy uncertainty, how much that actually affects the distributed PV pipeline. For example, people could have been thinking about installing solar PV on their rooftops, or businesses could have thought about installing it, but if by the time they actually installed the project, there was uncertainty whether or not they'd actually get support, they could have just held off their decision. So it actually remains to be seen how much, despite the fact that it will be extended, that uncertainty actually affected people's decisions and put a lull in the pipeline. The UK, we also saw a decline prior to COVID, or we're expecting a decline prior to COVID, 40% due to a transition between the Renewables Obligation Scheme, which was the main form of support, and uncertainty over how onshore wind and solar PV would be handled in the new support scheme, the Contracts for Difference. So there was a waning number of projects, or lull in the project pipeline that we expected last year when we did this update in May. Still, there was uncertainty in how those technologies would be incorporated, or when they'd be incorporated into the new support scheme. So continued to revise down the forecast. Now we see a decline of 62%, but also should be noted that that's also due to offshore wind having a high year in 2019. So in three major markets, yes, COVID-19 plays an impact, but also policy uncertainty does as well, that we were already starting to kind of feel and see the seeds of that already last year. However, there is one portion of the European market, if you go ahead and click Haney, which is distributed PV, and as you were saying earlier, that we do expect to be hit quite hard, and we do expect that hit to be almost entirely due to the crisis, COVID-19. So last year we thought there'd be stable growth due to the attractiveness of self-consumption, and some countries having net metering remuneration in place. Again, though, we underestimated the growth in 2019, which decreases a bit what we thought would happen in 2020, but also mostly due to the impacts of lockdown on installation rates, as well as new customer acquisition. But we also expect a decline due to uncertainty over the business case for distributed PV. If there is a weaker economic environment, or electricity prices are lower, it might not be as attractive. So the answer is partially due to COVID, but also due to some pre-existing policy uncertainty in a large part of the market.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. There's a question on whether we included the Green New Deal or not, which I will ask later. So this is coming live, so we will come back to that later related to Europe, just to give you a heads up on that one. So let's switch the continent. And I would like to turn into United States. In the United States, basically is the only region where we revised up our forecast compared to last year, despite the COVID. And I mean, I would like to ask Trevor, isn't this really surprising? And everybody can find this a bit counterintuitive, but if you can give us a little bit of an insight on this so that our audience can understand the reasons behind it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Amy. It's a great question because, as you mentioned, we did revise up the growth in the United States from the previous core forecast. And I think as we look at the figures, we can show that policy and incentive deadlines have really driven deployment in both the wind and solar sector historically. While we've seen these policies be extended in the years after those initial deadlines, this was expected to be the case again in 2020, even with COVID-19. As the production tax credit has a first deadline in 2020, and the investment tax credit begins to have deadlines as well. But as we mentioned in the report, what we've seen historically is the majority of these projects, they begin to really come online in Q4. And a delay at any point during the year, whether it be construction, equipment, personnel, it would have put downward pressure on this already compressed schedule. And what we're really happy to see is that we're seeing good policy flexibility, and it's really benefiting both wind and solar developers. United States, as the members of the U.S. Senate, as well as the U.S. Department of the Treasury, recognize the potential delays in equipment or construction with COVID-19, and they actually ended up extending the safe harbor projection, or the safe harbor provisions, for a 4 to 5 year build horizon for wind, as well as extending the amount of time that utility solar projects are allowed to receive their equipment. So this is why we're seeing these robust additions in both 20 and 2021. However, we do want to point out that while the utility scale sector in the United States is going to grow in 2020 and 2021, as we projected, we do have forecasted that distributed PV, that's residential PV and commercial PV, will not return to 2019 levels within this period. This is a common theme that we've been seeing regionally and throughout the world as individuals and small and medium enterprises begin to feel the economic impact of COVID-19. However, we think this is a great opportunity for federal, state, and local governments to be able to step in and continue policies or develop new policies that will really boost the sector.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Now we go back to Asia, and I would like to turn to my colleague Piotr. And obviously, India is a hot spot for renewable and especially solar and wind for the growth, with big expectations, big targets, and which is great potential to grow. However, India prior to COVID-19 had obviously a lot of challenges to accelerate the growth. Could you please explain us those existing challenges and how COVID-19 impacts those? Thank you very much.
Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you, Jaime, for your question. Well, first of all, it's important to remember that because of its geography, solar irradiation, and natural resources and size, India has an enormous potential for all renewable technologies. And this potential has been quite successfully exploited in recent years. Actually, capacity additions in the last 3 years in India allow it to be the third fastest growing renewable market in the world. So it is important to remember that when we are talking about challenges, we are already starting from the very high position of quite dynamic renewables growth. But accelerating this deployment of renewables to the levels required to reach very ambitious national targets proves more difficult. So, for example, in 2019, India installed about 2.4 gigawatts of wind capacity, while in order to reach its 2022 national target of 60 gigawatts, those annual installations in the remaining period should reach about 7.4 gigawatts. In case of PV, in 2019, 9.9 gigawatts were installed, but in order to reach 2022 targets, more than 20 gigawatts should be installed each remaining year. So as you can all see, even though current additions are very high, reaching those ambitious targets still requires some more effort. But about those challenges. First of all, the biggest that we see, which hinders acceleration in renewables deployment, is the full financial condition of distribution and electricity sales companies, called DISCOMs. DISCOMs suffer from a range of challenges, which cause them the inability to recover their full costs of electricity supply due to mainly technical losses in the grids, challenges with payment collections, and cross-subsidizing tariff policy between residential and commercial and industrial segments. Moreover, in recent years, the electricity demand growth was quite below the values expected and seen in the previous periods, which results in significant overcapacity in Indian electricity system. So, talking about numbers, in the period of 2014 to 2018, average annual electricity demand growth was on a level of 6%, while in 2019, before COVID crisis, it already stalled, and in 2020, a decrease of about 5% is expected due to COVID crisis and lockdowns. So central and local governments have taken actions to improve this situation. For example, UDAY scheme, which allowed state governments to transform part of DISCOM's dues to state government bonds and enforce performance improvement. And in some states, that program was successful, but despite that, total amounts due to electricity generations by DISCOMs kept growing through 2019 and the beginning of 2020, as you can see on the left-hand side figure. Yeah, this situation, the stress under which these are, results in delays in signing new PPAs with utility-scale developers, attempts to negotiate existing contracts, and overall high pressure to decrease energy procurement costs, which often is hurting renewable producers and developers. Those challenges in general increase risks faced by investors and actually discourage them from developing new projects. Other challenges which remain is the need for more investment in transmission and distribution grids to evacuate energy from large-scale projects, and issues connected with land procurement and acquisition. And the Indian government had some success in addressing the challenges by their solar parks initiative and central auctions, but still they hinder significant acceleration of large-scale projects. And apart from utility-scale projects, this challenging financial condition of DISCOMs is also impacting development of distributed PV systems, because the best paying customers of DISCOMs, which are industrial, commercial, and high-consuming residential customers, have the highest tariffs because of subsidizing, and the biggest incentive to invest in their own generation systems, which when they do, causes significant decrease in income of DISCOMs, which in turn discourages DISCOMs from providing much support and making them less willing to cooperate in order to enforce, to support the faster growth of distributed PV capacity. Because discoms are in big part responsible for conducting all administrative and technical procedures required for installing own PV rooftop system, then when they are not willingly cooperating, actually accelerating this capacity growth proves to be difficult. And when the COVID-19 crisis came, unfortunately, it exacerbates all those existing problems and adds new ones. So first of all, the electricity demand in India decreased by about 25% during the lockdowns, which further hurts discoms' revenues, especially that the decrease in demand was mainly in the most profitable sectors, so industrial and commercial ones. So the discoms' challenging financial situation is being made even worse with COVID-19. Plus, construction activity was significantly disturbed during the lockdown period, which in case of India is especially hurting because the lockdowns happened during the peak construction season before the start of the monsoon weather in the middle of the year. So those 2 months or month on delay during this high construction seasons may cause many installations to delay further into 2021, which we assumed in many cases in our forecast for 2020. Plus, delaying the commissioning of the projects also hurts finances of the developers because, well, they have to wait longer before the profits from electricity sales will begin. Another thing, due to overall distress in global economy, financing projects in emerging markets like India may be more difficult because banks may try to avoid investment in markets which they consider a bit more risky. And last, commercial and industrial and even individual investors probably may focus on their base activity and delay planned investments in distributed PV as the overall economic conditions are worsening. So, although this image painted by describing challenges seems a bit gloomy, it is important to remember that even the current pace of renewables deployment in India is very impressive, and we assume that even though in short term we might experience some slowdown in the investments, but the long-term prospects remain very optimistic, with further decreasing in costs of new installations, governments keeping their ambitions for overall capacity and supporting those ambitions with proper policies. It is important to remember that in this crisis also lies a chance to accelerate Indian energy transitions by focusing the recovery efforts on the renewable energy sector and use this time of disruptions to actually structurally resolve the challenges, especially connected with discoms' financial conditions and all other challenges unresolved today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Piotr. So please type your questions. We already have 15 questions that are being asked. You can use the question button because I'm moving to our last analyst, and after that we will start answering the questions. So the next question goes to Sophia, and this is basically a question that is interesting for everybody. Over the last 3 months on LinkedIn and Twitter, we have seen endless charts of the share of wind and solar increasing, reaching record levels on an hour, on a day, on various other conditions. So everybody has become really familiar due to decline in demand. So what's going on in the grid integration? So could you please give us a little bit of a flavor of what's going on in key countries? What were the developments in various countries that you see are interesting to share with our audience? And one of the most important questions, obviously, we did not see any blackout over the last 3 months due to COVID-19 demand decline, but did we see any electricity security problems or challenges during this crisis?
Thank you, Jaime, for your question. I think it's very interesting indeed, because the developments in various countries and regions has been varied. So some regions, like the ones you're showing, like Italy and Germany, have experienced well above record high hourly shares of variable renewables over their demand during comparing lockdown period and the same period last year. So these high shares are mainly due to two reasons: the low electricity demand because of the lockdown, but also because of the additional capacity that came online in 2019 and the first quarter of 2020. However, there are other regions that are seeing very similar shares to last year. So an example of this is California, which you can see in the middle of the graph. And California has experienced very similar general VRE profile and maximum shares as well. But this is actually because California's CAISO decided to curtail solar and wind due to mainly two things: local congestion and system-wide oversupply. And looking a little bit more in detail into this, the percentage of curtailment over VRE generation rose from about 4% to around 7% in comparing the months of April in 2019 and 2020. And this is because of capacity additions. Over 1 gigawatt came online in between the months of May 2019 and March 2020, but also because of the reduction in demand that we've been speaking about, which was about 8% in the months of April 2020 and April 2019. So these two factors have been the main drivers for these local congestions and system-wide oversupply. But now going to your main question of if we have faced security of supply problems, no, despite these increasing VRE shares, the security of supply has not been jeopardized during the current crisis, even in countries like Germany and Italy with record high penetration rates. I mean, however, this does not mean that we do not have a challenge ahead of us, because balancing supply and demand, especially in the summer months with higher PV generation at both utility scale but also distributed level, this poses a challenge, especially if the demand does not pick up rapidly. This would just entail that the system operators might require to use balancing tools more frequently and more often, or for longer periods of time, to balance these higher shares of VRE that are being and will be experienced. I hope this answered your question.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Now we will answer the questions. We have quite a bit, and I'm going to read them by three. So I invite all our analysts to turn off your cameras for now. Now we are entering into the questions and sessions. So our first question is related to why decline in installed capacity in 2020. Joseph Havani asking that he expects to remain stagnant or slight increase. I'm going to take that question. Please, others feel free to come in. The second question is basically on biofuels, or sorry, bioenergy for power. Farao, please come in to the screen. So what do we expect on power biomass? We talked about transport biofuels, so this will be on Farao. The third question is on European Green Deal. Yasmina, please come in. I will also contribute to the financing. The question is, to what extent did we take into account European Green Deal in our forecast in 2020 and 2021? And there are actually three questions related to that I'm combining. What is the EU Green Recovery announcement will affect the deployment on wind and energy storage in place investments? And these are the combination of those. Please, Yasmina, come in. So I'm going to start with why we expect a decline. In 2020, which is 13%. So if you look at the first 3 to 4 months of deployments in key large markets in the world, let me start with China. China, as you know, is 40 to 45%, depending on the technology, represents all the additions globally. So what happens in China obviously affects our annual additions trend in 2020. And when I look at China, in the first 4 months, China's wind capacity additions were lowest since 2015, and it's a decline compared to about 50%, maybe even slightly more actually in the first 4 months, due to the delays in the construction that we saw during the COVID-19 crisis. So you see the largest wind market dropping by more than 50% in the first 4 months. The similar situation happened in solar PV. Solar PV market has been declining in China over the last 3 years. And now, even in 2020, first month, we saw a 30% lower additions compared to last year. So obviously, this doesn't necessarily mean that companies can catch up very quickly these construction delays, but this is the biggest uncertainty as we see. When you look at the Europe, the growth in the Europe annual installations on wind and solar has been extremely slow in the first 4 months of the year. And actually, top markets only installed less than a gigawatt in the first months. And compared to expectations, this is significantly lower. India annual wind and solar PV additions in the first 4 months declined by about 30 to 50%, depending on the technology. So it obviously, we will check and update this forecast in the coming months, considering basically if the pace of construction increases rapidly or not. But as we see, when we published this report, the picture was rather slower than we were expecting in terms of the growth. That's why we show this decline. Obviously, the biggest hit, as we mentioned, is distributed PV. So this is we basically see this market actually shrinking pretty quickly in 2020 in the crisis period. And after this, I would like to turn to Farah on what do we expect on power biomass. Do we see the COVID-19 impact or not? Please, Farah.
Yes, so there will be some impact. So, I mean, I think as you flagged in your presentation, there's a differentiation between projects with short timescales for delivery and ones with longer timescales delivery. So bioenergy certainly falls into the camp of a slightly longer delivery period in construction than other renewable technologies. So there will be some levels of disruption to construction, causing delays. And then if we look at the fact that bioenergy for power is not as widespread, let's say, as wind and PV in terms of the number of markets that are significant, and when we consider where the major markets are for bioenergy for power now, you have, well, the number one is China by a long way, which I'll come back to, but then various European countries, certainly Japan, certainly Korea, and these are all some of the earliest to be affected by the pandemic in terms of lockdown measures. So certainly from an early stage of the crisis coming in, there would have been disruptions there to construction activity. Now on the fuel supply chain side, slightly less evident. So the fact is, let's say forestry operations and forestry management that creates the residues for wood chips and wood pellets, etc., is capable to do that with social distancing. So the main impact there is on less sawmill activity, which creates less residues for pellets. But even so, even on the fuel supply chain side, the disruption has been minimal. Now, taking the other side of things, we've seen in terms of annual additions, China's share has become larger and larger and larger in recent years, significantly driven by energy from waste deployment here. So bioenergy is particularly sensitive to what happens in China. So obviously there would have been disruption in the earlier part of this year, but of course we are seeing a slight return to normality there. So it remains to be seen how quickly the project delays incurred earlier in the year can be brought back. But then when we look at other major markets, India, Brazil, etc., and certainly in Europe, there's still ongoing restrictions. And the only other thing I would say is there are other drivers here which are causing a kind of lowering. So what we expect to see looking forward, even the next 2 years and beyond, is relatively stable bioenergy deployment in the region around 6 gigawatts per year. And this is because the policy outlook, when we have the consideration that there's higher generation costs now for bioenergy than you see for utility PV and on and offshore wind in many markets, and you see the corresponding movement of policy support from kind of guaranteed policy support at an administratively set level to competitive support, we can see that there are other drivers why bioenergy capacity additions are not going to increase in the same vein as wind and solar PV. So it's not a case of just directing everything towards the fact that it's COVID-19 that's dictating the capacity and trend. There are also wider policy factors as well.
Thank you very much, Frau. Now I switch to the European Green Deal question, whether we took it into account in our forecast, or if we took it, how did we take it, and what do we expect in the coming months in terms of the deployment. Yasmina, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks. Looking just over 2020 and 2021, we expect about 55 gigawatts of renewable capacity to come online in Europe. And this capacity is a result of either policies that were already in place to meet the EU 2020 targets, or policy that had already started trying to incentivize deployment towards the current EU 2030 target. Additionally, there is some capacity coming online, unsubsidized projects from corporate PPAs and in some cases merchant plants. But what you're seeing right now, stuff that's already being commissioned in 2020 and 2021 is stuff that's already been financed or under construction from policies to meet 2020 and 2030 targets. Now, the current 2030 target is about, I think it's 32% of renewable energy and gross final energy consumption. And right now, the way in our forecast, we are taking into account policies that countries are announcing or have already put in place. And this is under the framework of a 32% in order to meet a 32% gross renewable energy consumption target. Now, it's my understanding that the European Green Deal wants to put into law a net zero climate target for 2050, but proposes to raise the greenhouse gas emissions target from the current, I believe it is, I have here, 32% to 50%. So then what would have to happen then is the EU would have to reallocate how much of that would be for renewable energy, modify or revise how much, what the target would be for renewable energy, and then filter that back out into countries' national energy and climate action plans. And then countries would re-put into their policies or reformulate policies to meet that new target. So right now, just in 2020 and 2021, our forecast is just focused on the current 2020. Our forecast just reflects capacity that would be to meet the current 2030 renewable energy target, which is 32%, which corresponds to 32% greenhouse gas emissions in 2030. Should the proposal to increase the 2030 greenhouse gas target be passed, and then should that result in an increase in renewable energy consumption target, then yes, we would expect to have policies in place that would reflect that, and our forecast will reflect that as countries are going ahead and implementing those policies. We expect that, though, to be more towards the latter end, 2022, 2023, 2024, in a main case. What we haven't shown here is what we used to do is have an accelerated case or a case in which there would be enhanced policy action, and this would be a case we want to include the potential for policies to emerge in order to support that increased ambition. Going on to the other question, which was to what extent the EU recovery package is, if I understand correctly, Jaime, included in our forecast?
Yes.
At the moment, again, the 2020 and 2021 only reflects right now capacity from policy that are currently in place, or some capacity from unsubsidized projects that reflect market conditions. The EU recovery package, in my understanding, has qualitatively, obviously, highlighted substantial support for renewables. And I believe that there is not clear yet details on what specifically those policies would be, but as soon as those become clear, we would update that into our forecast. Now, obviously, some of the big numbers they've been throwing out there in terms of financial support is going to help countries that might have constrained budgets during this time to go ahead with existing plans. And then if they are going to put plans in on top of what they already have, so if there will be additional auctions, I'm just talking about renewable power here, if there are going to be additional auctions in order that are going to be put into place to make up for the slowdown that we see, obviously we were going to reflect that as soon as that information becomes available on a detailed level into our forecast, which hopefully we will be able to do in October.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. Just to reassess that, so once this is approved by all the countries, we will take that into account in a more detailed way in the update, probably, if it is approved and if it is actually gives a clear sign of how much money that will be allocated to what kind of technology. So we will definitely take that into account. Thank you, Yasmina. I have 3 more questions. The first one I will be taking is related to the rooftop PV sector, whether the companies will be interested or hesitant to fund rooftop PV projects given the circumstances. The second one is for Francois on heat. So basically, we basically saw the low oil prices now, and do we expect the companies to invest more in the fossil fuel related heat solutions when we see this, and the renewable heat alternatives require more funding, and how this can come about? So that's the question. Francois, please come in. And another question, important question, is related to India. How does India's recent stimulus package, which provides for overdue payments to generators, to impact our view, or Piotr, your view in India? I'm going to combine this question on India with another one on offshore wind in India. Do we expect something to come online in 2025 on onshore wind? Please, Piotr, come in. I'll start with the rooftop PV market. So in terms of the rooftop PV market, we obviously see this is the most challenging sector, but we talked about the challenges, but here I would like to talk about opportunities. So building sector and the building sector investment is one of the most job intensive ones among probably all energy technologies. So, and the combination of the building sector and rooftop PV policies under stimulus packages are actually created quite good opportunity for solar PV rooftop sector to pick up and come back to the picture pretty quickly. And the reason why I'm saying this, already we saw several policies from some countries, such as Italy, providing a 110% tax credit for including solar PV installations on rooftops. And we expect many European countries and several others to focus their stimulus packages on the building sector due to its job creation potential and boost the rooftop sector. So we are watching these stimulus packages, which will be included in our next update. So in this one, we did not assume possible stimulus packages. This is our forecast methodology. You may read this on our website. But overall, we see a good opportunity on the rooftop PV sector. It's the most effective, but it can be also the most boosting sector in the coming years. But again, depending on the government stimulus programs. On heat, Francois, so whether this low fossil fuel prices, are we going to see basically a significant increase in fossil fuel heating solutions investment because of this, or how do you see the markets? And maybe you can comment on what kind of stimulus packages governments can play with in order to not to fall into this, again, locked fossil fuel investments.
Okay, thank you for this question. Well, there are different things to take into account. The thing that the current high fossil fuel price may delay investment in renewable investment, because right now it affects the cost competitiveness of these renewable heat technologies. But there is something else to take into account, is that heat investment, like heat system, heat equipment, is generally long-term investment with equipment lasting 15, 20, 25 years, maybe more sometimes. And fossil fuel price can evolve radically in the future 15, 20, 30 years. So there is still one advantage that renewable heat have over fossil fuel, is that it brings better visibility on cost of equipment. However, this is also because most of the cost of these renewable options is concentrated in the investments, so it's an upfront cost, and so renewable heat has a high upfront cost. And this is one of the biggest challenge for renewable heat technology right now, and that's what policies should target in priority. So there are different types of policy which can help address that, like specific loans with low interest loans, or specific repayment schemes, energy service companies also can have a role, especially for households. So yeah, this upfront cost is very a big point, and yeah, I mostly see a delay in investment for renewable heat technologies, but structurally the need for renewable heats will continue to exist, and it will depend on how fast fossil fuel price will evolve. But in the long term, it's very difficult right now, and there is big uncertainties. So we can't give a single answer and a clear-cut answer to this question right now.
Thank you very much, Francois. Turning to you, Piotr. India stimulus package discounts. Did we include this into the forecast? I guess not, but I leave it to you. Are we going to include this in the upcoming update? And probably the second question is offshore wind in India.
Yes, thank you, Jaime. Well, in our current forecast, we assume that government was going to take some actions aimed at helping this situation. So we may say this is partly taken into consideration, although we didn't know the exact idea on how those stimulus might work. And in general, I would say that a lot depends on how such programs are actually implemented. And in case of India, it's a bit more complicated because of the dependencies between the central government and regional governments, and successfully solving challenge of discoms requires a very high and successful degree of cooperation between central and regional governments to implement some structural changes into the market, which would actually allow discoms to not only get rid of their due payments, but also actually generate revenue in the longer term. So this requires so big cooperation and communication with the society overall. For example,
very much. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
In case of offshore, we'll come back to the forecast for 2025, but I think we would rather not see offshore coming in such a short period of time.
Great, thank you very much. So next question is on Africa. Trevor, please come in. There's a question on Africa, which basically says that Africa has been falling behind in terms of the investments on renewable energy. And what do we expect in the forecast? How does this affect it? We did not really talk about Africa. If you can give some insights on this, that will be great. The next question is on Mexico. Sophia, please join in. The question talks about the recent change of this grid not connecting renewable companies. How did we take that into account in the forecast? You can basically tell our audience that we had a 2-hour discussion how to include or not, and I will jump in as well. Another question is basically on the biofuels, Farao, if you can come in. One on the disinfectants and biofuels industry turning into disinfectants and producing these chemical products to basically tackle some of the hygiene challenges that we had under COVID-19. So does this affect the overall thing? And the second question on bioenergy is related to Asia. So how do you see the biofuels policies in Asia? You quickly mentioned this, but there's also connected with another question is the development of waste to energy. Is it still affected? Because this was the hot spot before. Is it still true that we can say about the waste to energy? I'll start with Trevor, Africa.
Excellent. Thank you, Jaime. It's a very good question. And we took an approach to Africa. We believe it's going to be impacted by COVID-19 like the rest of the market is. Something that we have looked at is availability of financing, especially for countries that would potentially rely on oil for some of their main revenues. I think that could be a concern. As we look at some of the lockdown measures that have been put in place, such as in South Africa, that's also going to have an impact on development that was occurring this year. Something that's very interesting, though, is we do see development happening in certain sectors, such as in the geothermal sector in Kenya, which is a very active sector that we see will come, more projects come online in 2021. We're also very excited about some of the IPPs in other countries that are continuing to build. For example, in South Africa, before the lockdown, there was a project that came online before the lockdown measures went into effect, which added to the capacity in 2020. So these are all positive developments that we've seen before COVID. As for after COVID, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're concerned about the availability of financing that will allow these projects to continue and allow governments to continue to fund these types of projects.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Sophia, Mexico.
Yes, so we did have a long discussion on this, and well, there are basically 2 approaches that we took. Just to give a little bit of a background, SENACE's Mexico system operator passed decree in which they would suspend any projects coming online and that were under testing, so they would suspend it. So what we did was really to consider that the projects that were already under testing, and this is something that we've seen that's happening right now, that those utilities or firms have been requesting court permissions to actually come online. So we assume that those would come online this year because they already fully functional. They were just in the testing phase. So we assume that those 4 PV and 4 wind came online. And we assumed also that for the ones that were about to go into testing, they would come online in 2021, and those that were actually about to finish construction, part of them would also come online 2021 or afterwards. But yeah, we mostly rely on that, and I don't know if you have something to add on this, Jaime?
Thank you very much, Sophia. Yes, so it was very complicated. We couldn't do what basically to include, and we in the end took a conservative approach, and assuming an easing of this measures, but also impacting some of the delays. So this was the middle point that we decided. Obviously, if we see a change already in the phase of connections, we will basically update our forecast accordingly. Thank you very much, Sophia. Farah, two questions, one on disinfectants and biofuels industry, ethanol industry, and the second one on waste to energy and Asia's role in biofuels.
Okay, so just to clarify, the question on Asia is only relating to energy from waste, not the transport biofuel side.
Both.
Okay, all right. All right, let's split this into three then. So to start with the disinfectant, certainly true. So ethanol plants started to diversify into producing ethanol for hand sanitizer. I mean, that was evident in the EU, it was evident in the US, in South America as well. In terms of how that affects the market, so first of all, we produce a production forecast, not a consumption in transport forecast. So yes, the implications of that additional market was factored into the forecast. It's worth saying, though, that the actual, generally, we would say that the additional demand created from hand sanitizer would not offset the lost demand from the significant reduction in biofuels for transport. That's the general point, although you do need to look at certain factors. So let's consider US and Europe. So the US obviously has very significant ethanol production, the global leader, population of what, around 330 million people. Now the EU has a very small production of ethanol compared to the US, some around 5 billion liters, but a population of the EU around 400 plus 450 million people, right? So the ratio of people with each person having a few millimeters of hand sanitizer to ethanol production is a lot more healthy in terms of that market than you would see in the US. Whether this is a prolonged market trend, I think it remains to be seen. Now, second point on Asia, sticking with the transport biofuel side just quickly, market prospects very different. So the biggest policy change we've seen in the last few months actually happened pre-COVID-19, and this was China saying it had originally stated it would move to 10% ethanol blends nationwide in 2020. In our forecast, we didn't anticipate that being hit anyway, but now the narrative has slightly changed to we're not going to see nationwide ethanol E10 blends, but the number of provinces that have already started programs to extend E10, which is moving from 10, 11, where it was already established, to 15, they can continue their programs. So that's caused a readjustment downward of our forecast. We actually were on track to do that pre-COVID-19. Then you've got a few countries, as I mentioned when I was speaking earlier, Malaysia was a good example, and Thailand, that had programs to extend higher blends of biodiesel and ethanol. In the case of Thailand, roll them out, so they're available at the pump. And these have been paused due to the additional cost of subsidization and also disruption during this period. Then you've got India, which has been on a kind of up and down road with regards to its ethanol, but the long-term objectives are very strong, driven by security of supply, to increase the role of ethanol. First of all, 10%, and then reaching eventually 20% is the policy objective. And last year was almost 5%. So the long-term policy objective is still there. In the short term, this year, of course, there has been disruption, as in everyone else, constrained level of storage, plants coming offline. But the oil marketing companies are still releasing tenders for ethanol, so the demand is still potentially there, although their overall pool of transport of gasoline to blend ethanol into is smaller. And then you have Indonesia, where they have a case where they've just introduced a 30% mandate for biodiesel, and the intention was to move to 40%. But now the kind of vehicle testing needed to increase that blend has again been kind of paused, delayed in this period of low oil prices, and we'll remain to see how that develops, because it's not just the policy intention to increase, again driven by security of supply. It's also the actual technical feasibility of vehicles vis-a-vis 40% blend. Now, the final part of your question was around energy from waste. This is an area that's gaining importance in terms of the bioenergy in the power sector, and certainly Asia is probably going to be the focal point moving forward. In the OECD, a lot of energy from waste capacity is almost saturated. It's not growing so quickly. Apart from certain markets, certainly the UK is a robust market. But when we look at Asia, where you have the rate of economic growth is stronger, the rate of population growth is also strong, and you have real strong growth in cities, etc., and urbanization, then the sheer demand and pace of creation of municipal solid waste needs rapid solutions. Now, in an ideal world, of course, you have a hierarchy of waste management options, of which you have right at the bottom landfill, and just above that energy from waste, and then you have, of course, reuse and recycling and all these kind of programs. But the sheer pace that this waste is being created and the drivers for demand volume reduction of that waste means energy from waste is a part of that solution in Asia. And we're already seeing certainly China is leading here in terms of the deployment, whereas other markets, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, are starting to put together a policy puzzle to make it grow. So those are really long-term drivers that, regarding leaving COVID-19 aside, we would expect to see Asia, energy from waste prosper in Asia.
Thank you very much, Farao. So we came to the end of our 1.5 hour. Before I close, there are a few questions on the low interest rates and various related to new financing mechanisms. So I will address those and close the session. We could not reply to all the questions, so there are a few specific ones that we will come back to you after the webinar. They are too specific, so we will basically definitely share our views on those. But in general, I'd like to address this financing of the new renewable projects in the environment of zero interest rate capitals. So interest rates have been extremely low over the last 3, 4, 5 years, and obviously renewable projects took advantage of those extensively. However, an important change that we show in our investment report, with the declining oil demand and the prices, the return on oil related assets are basically getting lower and lower despite low interest rates. And compared to those, investment in wind and solar, for instance, in terms of renewable energy projects, are becoming more and more attractive. However, this obviously does not translate directly. All this money that is not invested in oil and gas will be invested directly in renewables. This creates a good opportunity for renewables because their returns are higher. But I would like to mention that those returns are also dependent on government policies, because most of the growth that we expect are coming from policies that are either assumed in our forecast or announced by the governments and auction schedules. And what we saw, several countries are postponing or delaying or canceling their renewable energy auctions already. And as Farao mentioned, some of the Asian countries delaying their implementation of the mandates or higher mandates that they will have introduced, that we are taking into account. So we see these policy changes also on the negative side coming into the picture. But we also saw several positive developments, as you probably follow as well. So we are trying to take a balanced approach, integrating all of those in our upcoming forecast, and reassess the market based on more information, and probably will mention in the last quarter of the year. Thank you very much for all those who participated in the webinar and all your attention. We had more than 500 people connected and listened to the webinar. And thank you very much for your interest. And please do ask any further questions if you have them. Thank you very much to all my colleagues for their contribution and the great discussion. And we hope to see you soon in another webinar. Have a nice afternoon, morning, or night, wherever you are.